Hello, I am Andrea and I am from the Lewis and Clark Library, East Helena branch. And first of all, a little bit of business out of the way. We are recording this webinar and it will be starting, it has started already, and then it'll go just before the questions start, and we will stop recording at the end of that. So lo and behold, let me introduce our presenter. This is Jane Bradbury, and she is an historic interpreter and scholar who brings history to life for audiences of all ages. She is an artist in residence for the C.M. Russell Museum in Great Falls and the Montana Historical Society in Helena. And she will introduce herself and get into the presentation.
All right. Well, it's great to be here today. Let me just do a little technical stuff. Oh, yes, we're also used to Zoom now, and I wish I so could be with you all in person. But as the introduction said, I'm an interpreter of history. I like to interpret women's stories. And this particular story, Calamity Jane, has had a lot of iterations over the years. A lot of books have been written, both fiction and nonfiction, taking this story apart and looking at it. And as times change and our perspective on women in the West change, we change how we tell the story. So I understand a number of you have read a book about Calamity Jane's story. When I was asked to present Calamity Jane, I realized I couldn't do it as her because she was a very different person than I am. And I think I'm a good actor, but I think that would be a stretch. But I chose to tell her story from the point of view of her friend, Dora DuFran, who very well knew the life of those mining camps in the early days and the Western frontier and watched it all change. I've chosen to place Dora in 1932. And so the Wild West has pretty much gone into its mythological status. And Dora has come to a place in her life where she's a little philosophical about all those things in the past. And from that point of view and that position in her time and her life, she'll look back on Martha's life, Martha Canary, Calamity Jane, and give us a perspective. Now, hang on real quick, because I just have a few finishing touches to let Dora come to life herself. Be right back. "1932? Well, where does the time go? Sometimes I wonder if I'll have enough time to get everything done that I want to in this life. Do you ever feel that way? That you might run out of time before you get everything done? Oh, and this time of year, well, this time of year with spring coming, the snow is melting. It's time to get up to Mount Moriah Cemetery and start tending the graves and getting them ready for flower planting. I always take very good care of my husband's grave. He's been gone for 9 years now, and Martha Canary, my dear friend, is buried just a little bit away from him. So I tend both of those places. And that reminds me, I got a letter from a reporter in Denver, a Mr. Parker, and he's writing a story about the Old West, and he heard that I knew Calamity Jane. And he wanted to interview me about that. And therein lies the problem. Does he want to know about the mythological person, Calamity Jane? Or does he want to know about the real woman, Martha Canary, my friend, who struggled mightily all her life to try and live up to the expectations that people had of Calamity Jane? Martha could be a real nuisance to her friends. But that gun-toting, Indian fighting, military scouting person, Calamity Jane, that wasn't who she was at all. As far as I know, she never hurt a living soul, and she'd give you her last dime if she thought you needed it. That was the one thing that could sober her up. Tell her that somebody needed her. Now, there was a time, not so very long ago, that no one wanted to talk to someone like me, a successful parlor house madam from the old days. But now it seems like nobody can get enough of all the stories of the Old West, which I lived and endured. Everyone wants to hear our stories before we're gone. I came to Deadwood in the 1880s, and I had a string of successful parlor houses. The sporting business was a good business for a woman because there was a lot of opportunity on the frontier, and it was the one enterprise where there was no prejudice against a woman with ambition. That was a long time ago. I was a lot younger then. So when I think about what I might tell this Mr. Parker about Martha, I think I'll just tell him the story as I know it. Martha did the best she could with what she was given, and she wasn't given much. In her later years, when she was so sick, and I thought about the lively little girl she must have been, growing up there in Princeton, Missouri, with such parents as she had. Her father was a failed farmer, a gambler. Her mother, a prostitute who spent most of her time in town entertaining questionable gentlemen, I'm sure. And they just left Martha at home to look after her younger brother and sister. Then, when Martha was about 8 or 10 years old, the family packed up everything and moved from Missouri to Virginia City, Montana. Within a couple of years, both of those parents were dead, leaving Martha with a couple of siblings that she had to look after. And she was just a child herself. People in the mining camps have one thing on their minds and one thing only, and that's to get rich. And they certainly don't care about children. They certainly don't especially care about orphans. But Martha was clever. She learned how to live by her wits early on. And a couple of years later, she found homes for those children, and then she took off to carve out her career as best she could. She went through Wyoming. Those were the days when the Transcontinental Railroad was being built and towns were springing up. And she followed the military camps, the railroad camps, the mining camps. She learned how to ride and she learned how to shoot. She followed the freight wagon trains and she learned how to drive. She could drive oxen or mules or horses. She learned how to drink and she learned how to swear. She could use language that would make a bullwhacker blush. Now, later in her life, she would tell stories about those years, how she was chasing outlaws across Arizona or following the Nez Perce across Montana. But those were all tall tales. The dates and times and likelihood that any of that could have ever happened were impossible. No, she was living by her wits and learning how to take care of herself in a world that was not very kind to women. In 1876, the whole history of the West starts to change. When Martha rode into Deadwood Gulch in the summer of 1876, now she was 19 years old. She was rough, she was strong, she was big-hearted, and the name Calamity Jane was already associated with her. You see, the summer before, 1875, there was an expedition to the Black Hills. And on those expeditions, usually led by the military of some sort, there were reporters and photographers and people who made maps. There were geologists all looking at this new land in the West. And on this particular expedition, there was a woman. The reporter noted that she was strong, she could work like a man, she could drink and swear like a man, and she had no idea about morality. And when he wrote up his article, he remarked that someone had mentioned if that woman ever walked away from camp and got hurt or injured or something, that would be a calamity. When the reporter made his article, he attached the name Jane to that word, calamity, because Jane was a common name for a loose woman, and Calamity Jane was born, right there in print, the summer of 1875. And when you looked at the Black Hills, where this expedition was, and where that woman supposedly was, well, there was no other woman in the West that could even begin to match the description, except for Martha. And so, when she rode into Deadwood that summer, Martha Canary and Calamity Jane were one and the same. Oh, the Deadwood Gulch that summer, gone from a handful of miners to almost 10,000 in just a few months. Can you imagine what it sounded like? All those people and animals and wagons crowded into that short gulch. And can you imagine what it smelled like? Mud and muck and manure up to people's knees. And well, the lower part of town was called the Badlands. That's where the saloons and brothels and gambling houses were. And of course, that's right where Martha went because, well, let's face it, those were the people who took her in all those years when she was trying to find out how to live by her wits. So she understood that world, and that's where she was most comfortable. Now, I came to Deadwood in the 1880s. I set up my first parlor house and was successful in business and began to expand a little bit. I knew about Martha because I'd heard so much about her antics. But, well, I also heard that she was a very kind person. And there were so many stories about that kindness that they couldn't all be made up. And sure enough, one of them was about the smallpox epidemic that swept through the Gulch in 1878. The first 8 men who came down with smallpox, they were quarantined up on the shoulder of the hill there, and nobody would go near them. But Martha said, I will. And she rigged up a little system with the miners down below. She would lower a basket, and up would come food or water or medicine, whatever she asked for. And her medicines were cream of tartar and Epsom salt. If one of the men died, she would wrap him in a blanket and haul her down to the miners below to dig a grave, lower the body down, and then she walked down the hill herself and buried that boy. She only knew one prayer: now I lay me down to sleep. So that was the funeral oration that was preached over those who died. But of the 8 who she took care of, she brought 5 of them out of the shadow of death, and many more were helped by her before the whole thing ran its course. And so when I got there, and I could hear her before I could see her, she would get howling drunk, and no one was escaping that noise. I was honestly a little afraid to meet her. I heard so much about her antics, and yet, as I say, stories of her kindness were legends. So one night I found her. There she was. She was sitting on the edge of a boardwalk. Her feet were in a puddle in the street, and her chin was resting on her hand. She was taking a nap. Well, I got her up and brought her to my house, and that began a friendship that lasted until she died. She worked for me on and off over the years, various capacities, and she was a good cook. I would always hire her if she was around, and she usually kept her word if she gave it. She left Deadwood not long after that, and, well, all the stories that people would hear about her coming and going across the prairie. But here's the interesting thing about Martha. She might have been no more than a local Black Hills character. Oh, every place in the West had people like that. And she might have not been anything more than that, except for one thing, and it goes back to that article from 1875 in that Chicago newspaper. You see, a man named Ed Wheeler saw that article, and he thought that name, Calamity Jane, was quite catching. He was a writer of dime novels. Oh, all sorts of fictionalized serial novels about whatever fantasy anyone could come up with. And at that time, people in the East couldn't get enough about the stories in the West. So Mr. Wheeler took that name and created a series of over 30 novels about Deadwood Dick and Calamity Jane. Oh, Deadwood Dick and Calamity Jane were always getting into tremendously dangerous situations, but they were smart and clever and they could get out. The Calamity Jane in the novels was, well, she smoked a cigar, she wore buckskins, she rode her horse astride, she didn't drink or smoke, she had high moral standards. She was from a good family in the East, but after her lover betrayed her, she came west for adventure. The Calamity Jane in the novels was bold and beautiful and gracious and, again, of high moral character. The Calamity Jane in the novels rode her unsaddled horse over the prairies, her hair streaming out from under her slouched hat, a twinkle of excitement in her eyes, and a whoop of joy escaping her lips. Now, the Calamity Jane in the Black Hills and the Calamity Jane in the novels were two entirely different people. Calamity Jane in Deadwood could get howling drunk, behave in the lowest of fashions. And as I said, most people couldn't wait for her to move on because she was kind of a nuisance most of the time. So with that legacy of those novels on her shoulders, off she would go. And there would be so many stories that would come back to Deadwood. Everybody who passed through the towns in those days had some sort of a story about what Martha was up to. She opened restaurants, she opened gambling houses, she opened brothels, laundries. She loved to dance. From time to time, she would open a hurdy-gurdy house. And well, a hurdy-gurdy dancer could make a lot of money. You could get the money from the dance that you sold, and then any percentage of the liquor that you got your partner to drink. And then, of course, there was always a room upstairs or in the back, so there could be additional entertainment. So contrary to what everybody who was reading the novels was thinking, Calamity Jane was not chasing outlaws across the West. She was not saving stranded travelers. She was trying to live her life and put a roof over her head and food in her stomach, like a lot of women in the West at that time. A lot of women who came west and had no family, no education, and no money, didn't want to be a farm wife or a factory worker in the East. They thought it would be an adventure. They thought there'd be opportunities for them in the West. And what they found out was that the opportunities that awaited a woman in those circumstances was the red light district, prostitution, the largest employer of women in the West, and legal. People don't like to talk about it. People don't like to talk about it. But if you lived in the towns then, if you lived in those early Western towns, prostitution, gambling, everything was side by side with what other people in town were doing. Everybody was working and living side by side, trying to build up a community in the West. But as I said, people didn't like talking about it and don't like it today. Prostitution is the exchange of sex for money. And while you might think that is the most tawdry and distasteful part of the sporting life in the West, with 10 or 15 or 20 or 50 or 100 men to every woman, prostitution was expected, condoned, and appreciated, not the least by the towns, because they made a lot of money off it. Oh, there were taxes on the businesses. There were fines for the women on any slight infraction, payoffs to town officials. But it worked out. I mean, when I think about it, there was kind of an equilibrium that was attained. People on one side of morality and on the other found a way to get along, and everybody profited. The towns got their money and the girls found a way to make a living. Now, there's no question that I made my business of prostitution in the red light district, vice, if you will. It was a good way to make money, and I made a lot of it. And most women who were successful in the business could buy and sell all the people on the town council who were constantly trying to restrict the red light district. But talk about charitable donations, hospitals, charities, orphanages. Madams were some of the biggest supporters of those institutions, but don't expect you to find your name on any donors list. Oh, there's so many stories from those times, but well, people don't tell them anymore. Jenny Rogers. Jenny Rogers was the queen of the red light district in Denver. And one time the Denver City Council decided, because they had been getting so much pressure from proper people in town about maybe closing down the red light district, they thought they'd start small. So they decided to have every woman who worked in the district wear a yellow ribbon when she was in the streets, and that yellow ribbon would denote what her business was, and proper people could avoid her if they wanted to. Jenny Rogers got the other madams on Market Street together, and they decided they would help the city council out. So they dressed all their girls in yellow dresses, yellow parasols, yellow hats and shoes, and they got into carriages and drove up and down the streets of Denver. Well, here we are. If yellow's the color that's going to tell you who we are, we might as well help you out. It wasn't 2 days before that foolish ordinance was taken back, and those hypocritical city fathers had to go back and find another way to attack this prosperous business. And myself, now, any person who's in business knows that if you run a clean operation, if you have the highest of standards, I did. My girls were always well dressed. My houses were always clean. But in the West, there's one thing you really can't avoid, and that is rodents, rats and mice. And no matter how clean you keep something, if you're out on the prairie, you're going to have some vermin in the house. And well, one time my lawyer came back from Cheyenne. He said, Dora, I brought you 12 cats so that you could see if those might help with your rat problem. And sure enough, I put them in the house, and well, things cleaned up pretty quickly. However, word got out that this was an even better establishment to take your business to. And so men began to gather in the streets outside of the house, and men being men, they caused a lot of commotion. And well, it wasn't long before some citizens complained that there were street crowds. And when the city fathers got together, they decided that there should be no houses of prostitution within the city limits. Well, then, of course, my house was smack dab in the middle of the city. So when we went to court, my lawyer said, now, Judge, Dora does not have a house of prostitution. She has a home for cats. And she likes cats so much that she put a girl in every room to keep the cats company. And you must like cats yourself, Judge, because you were just there the other day. Well, the judge ruled that cat houses were exempt from the law. Oh, well, as I said, those stories are entertaining and they don't get told very much anymore, but it is, after all, the entertainment business. It wasn't so entertaining where Martha was. Martha was not a high-class working girl, not a middle-class working girl. Martha usually worked in the lowest of places, but remember, those are the people that she understood. That was the life that she lived. She always stood up for the people that she felt protective of. One time, when she'd first come to Deadwood, she had a friend, a fellow working girl, named Little Tidbit. Well, Tidbit had been hired by Laughing Sam, the faro dealer, for some entertainment, and when he paid her, it was supposed to be a little pouch of gold dust, but what it was black sand with brass filings. Worthless. Well, Tidbit had no recourse at all, but when Martha found out about it, she borrowed a pair of pearl-handled 44s, and she went into that gambling house, and she called Laughing Sam out in front of everybody, told everybody in the establishment what he had done, and then proceeded to cuss him upside one side and down the other, something he'd probably never heard. And in the end, he had to pay Tidbit 2 $20 gold pieces. And then later, when times were not so highfalutin, Martha was working in a brothel, and a man came in, passed out, dead drunk, woke up the next morning, $50 was missing. He said, Martha took it. Well, when Martha was brought before the judge, he said, did you take this man's money? She said, yes, I took it. If I hadn't taken it, somebody else would have. And the judge asked, well, what did you do with it? She said, well, I used it to pay the hospital bill for one of the girls who was too poor and too sick to pay it herself. So the judge, in a remarkable moment of frontier justice, turned to the man and said, if you would quit drinking and stay out of disreputable houses, you wouldn't have to pay other people's hospital bills. I know there are those who say not every woman in poor circumstances succumbed to the red light district, to the sporting life, and I agree with you. Not everyone did. But people who have plenty to eat hardly know how good food tastes when you've been hungry for a long time. The wages of sin are indeed wages, and they will buy food. Now, I didn't see Martha again until 1893. I was in Chicago, the great Columbian exhibition there, the World's Fair. And I was getting on a streetcar on Dearborn Street, and I heard someone call from behind me, hey, where do you think you're going? And I turned around, and there she was. Oh, she was just the same Martha as I'd always known. And of course, she had a tale of woe. She'd been hired by the Midway concessions to get up on stage. Calamity Jane, original wild woman of the West, Indian scout, gunfighter, and oh, well, she was drawing crowds like crazy every night, and she'd managed to stay sober for it until a friend of hers from Montana stopped by to see her, and he had a quart of whiskey. And well, they consumed about half of it before she got up for her show that particular night. And she was holding herself together, she said, pretty well, until a fellow in the back got up and said in a real loud voice, that's not Calamity Jane, that's a fake. Well, Martha drew her guns and ran down the aisle of that concession. I'll show you who I am, you lop-eared, slab-sided, dirty-necked, knock-kneed, splay-footed, pigeon-toed son of a coyote. I'll show you who I am. And she started shooting at his feet. I'm the real Calamity Jane. I'm a howling coyote from Bitter Creek, and the further up the creek, the bitterer it gets. And I'm from the head end. Now apologize before I shoot your toes off. And she punctuated the whole thing with hoots and shots. Well, of course, the man apologized. And if there was anyone else in the vicinity who had any question about whether or not she was the real Calamity Jane, they didn't speak up. But of course, that was too much for the tender feet of Chicago. So she was fired. When I ran into her now, she was off again to some other location to see what commotion she could cause. In 1895, she came back to Deadwood after being gone for a long time. And anyone who expected to see a buckskin-clad, gun-toting, wild woman of the West was sorely disappointed. She was wearing a simple dress, a little bonnet on her head. She was with a young girl, a 9-year-old girl. She said her name was Jessie, and this was her daughter. And she said she wanted to come back. She had no money. But she wanted to put Jessie into the convent school over in Sturgis. She wanted to get a good job so she could do that. Of course, her old friends from the old days, we all rallied around her and had a fundraiser at one of the saloons in the Badlands there. And well, it was very successful. Made a lot of money, but they had the poor judgment to give her that money that night. Because once she started buying a few rounds of drinks for herself and her friends, why, any thoughts of higher education for Jessie went out the window. By morning, there was just enough left to put Jessie into the school in Sturgis, and then Martha headed off. She joined up with the Cole and Middleton Wild West show. And she managed to make it a few weeks before she quit there and went off up to Dawson in the Yukon Territory, the last of the boom camps, the last of the really Wild West that there ever was going to be on this earth, I believe. That was her world. She didn't last long there. She did not have a very successful business in whatever it was she tried, but this was hard on Martha. Towns in the States were growing up, and they didn't want wild, unruly characters like Martha passing through anymore. She belonged on a Western frontier that was passing away. It was breaking her heart, I'm sure. And she hated those Wild West shows. Oh, those shows were slapped together with all sorts of fictionalized ideas about what the West was. And she didn't like it. She said, I was one of the people who kept the West wild. Why should I get up on stage and be a spectacle for a bunch of dudes who really don't care about what it really was like? Martha just didn't fit in anymore. And she couldn't be persuaded to change or be pushed into a different way of life. And it wasn't all her fault, I have to say. The press, the press, and the people who egged her on and wanted her to keep being who she was, they wouldn't let her change, even if she had wanted to. The last time I saw her, she came back to Denver in 1903. Oh, the years had taken a toll on her. She was dressed in a very shabby calico dress with a little satchel, a few trinkets, another shabby dress in there. But she was still Calamity Jane. So she made the rounds of Deadwood and Lead and finally came up to Belle Fourche. That's where I had my most successful parlor house venture ever. Diddling Doris, drinking, dining, and dancing. And I hired her. She's a good cook. As long as she could stay sober, she knew she had a job with me. But it wasn't 6 weeks before she decided she needed to draw her pay and move on. And then we waved our final goodbyes when she was sitting behind a cowboy on his horse, riding up over the hill just out of town, whooping and hollering, waving. She went on a bender then and then decided to take the stage back to Deadwood, but she only got as far as a small mining town called Terry when she collapsed. And the hotel owner there and his wife, they tried to help her, but there wasn't anything they could do. Martha died. It was August 1903. She was 47 years old. Her funeral was the biggest in Deadwood history. Oh, there were people who said she was a ne'er-do-well and a terrible person, and she was better off forgotten. There were a lot of us who forgave her trespasses, who knew the goodness that she always showed deep down. Her casket was buried in flowers. We'd had a conversation not long before, and we were talking about death and keeping of graves and such. And she said, Dora, I can't think of a person who would plant a cactus on my grave. And I told her that if I outlived her, I would make sure her grave was tended. And she sleeps today beneath a headstone that I placed there and a couple of stone urns that I put flowers in, but so do a lot of other people. And of course, this time of year when we're all thinking of flowers and growth, why, her grave will be covered again with flowers that all sorts of people come and plant. Maybe she knows about that. Sometimes when I'm up there on the hill, I stop and listen to the wind in those tall pine trees. What a beautiful place. What a beautiful rest place. Those trees sound like they're sighing. Why has her legend lasted so long? Martha Canary, who would want to be her? She had a wretched life and a terrible ending to it. She was drunk most of the time. She didn't have a home to speak of. She was sleeping in barns, sleeping off fenders. She was hungry most of the time. She took up with men who treated her poorly. And then she was egged on by people who wanted her to be that myth of the West, buying her drinks and she telling her lies and stories until the cows come home. Who would want to be that? But Calamity Jane, now that's another proposition. I can just bet you there were plenty of Victorian ladies stuffed in corsets and stuffed in parlors and stuffed in Victorian rules who snuck a peek or two at some of those dime novels and read about the life of Calamity Jane. Calamity Jane didn't follow anybody's rules. She made her own. She slapped the face of convention and went off on her own path. Calamity Jane, who rode her unsaddled horse across the prairie, her hair flowing out from under her slouched hat, a twinkle of excitement in her eyes, and a whoop of joy escaping her lips. And the press, well, you talk about a tawdry and distasteful business. The way they hounded her, the way they egged her on and then made fun of her. And then if she did try to change, they made even more fun of her. Yes, she caused a lot of commotion wherever she went, but the press was always so viciously unkind. And she knew it. She told a friend of ours, Teddy Blue Abbott, an old cowboy from the early days, she said, "Teddy Blue, why can't they leave me alone and let me go to hell my own way?" It's supposed to change now, 1932, women have the vote. Oh, and then they have a lot of opportunities for education. They're supposed to have opportunities for careers and more to do so that there wouldn't have to be a section of women that don't have a lot of things to look forward to in life. But here's what I think of that. You can change all the laws you want to. Until you change people's minds about what women are capable of, how they should be valued, and until you change the minds of the women themselves so that they understand that they're valuable no matter what, then it'll take a long time for things to really, truly change in this society. It's easy for a woman to be good if she's protected from the evils of the world, and Martha was not that lucky. She had more on her shoulders than most women could ever imagine, and she did many good things in spite of it. And honestly, she had a very sensitive soul. One time we were talking, and she said to me, "Dora, have you ever seen the morning star?" I had to admit to her, I've not seen morning star. She said, "I saw it today. The clouds parted, and there it was, just shining so bright. And I wanted to show it to somebody, but what was I going to say? Come here and look at a star?" So I just sat quietly with myself and watched that star. It sure took me back to the old days. Well, I wonder sometimes if Martha had had a different childhood, had a different life to begin with, we wouldn't have a Calamity Jane. Who is she then? Who is she really? Well, I would say she's whoever you want her to be. She's a product of her times and her upbringing and your imagination. So when I think about what I might tell this reporter who's going to be interviewing me about her life, I think maybe I won't tell him everything. And maybe I won't tell him anything. Maybe I'll just tell him that whatever he knows about her, that's the story he should print. That way she can go on being the myth. She can go on being the story that we've all come to notice. Maybe Martha would want it that way.